My name is Laura Banks. I am 39 years old, a family therapist with a small private practice downtown, the kind of woman who spends 8 hours a day teaching other people how to recognize the invisible patterns running their families into the ground. And on the evening of my own birthday this year, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a slice of grocery store cake I'd bought for myself, scrolling through my phone, when I finally saw the pattern running my own family into the ground too. Nobody had called, not my mother, not my sister, not even a text from my husband, who had left that morning saying only that work was going to run late. I told myself, the way I always told myself, that everyone was simply busy, that birthdays got complicated once you were 39 and not 9, that it didn't mean anything. I ate my slice of cake alone at 8 o'clock, half convinced myself I didn't even mind, and then, because I couldn't help it, opened Instagram to see what everyone else's evening looked like. The first photo that loaded was my sister Renee, laughing under a canopy of gold balloons that spelled out her name, a cake the size of a wedding centerpiece in front of her, my mother's arm looped through hers, both of them glowing under string lights, strung across what was unmistakably my mother's own backyard. I scrolled once, twice, my thumb going numb, before I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't an old photo. The timestamp read 2 hours ago, and standing just behind Renee, grinning at something off camera, holding a paper plate of cake, was my husband Mark. It was my birthday. It was also, apparently, the day my entire family had chosen to throw my younger sister a party instead. In the same house where our mother had, every single year for as long as I could remember, found some reason my own birthday needed to be smaller, quieter, postponed, or simply skipped altogether. I sat very still at my kitchen table with the phone glowing in my hand, running the math I had never once, in 39 years, allowed myself to run out loud. Was this really the first year it had happened? Or had I spent my entire life training myself not to notice, to understand how I ended up staring at that photograph without even the reflex to feel surprised? You would have to understand the particular shape of my family, built long before I had any language for what was happening inside it. My mother, Doreen, was not a cruel woman in any obvious sense. She showed up to school events. She kept photographs of both her daughters on the refrigerator. But there was a current running underneath everything she did, one I only learned to name once I'd spent a career teaching other people to name theirs. And that current ran, without fail, in Renee's direction. Renee was 2 years younger than me, easier in every sense my mother seemed to value. She cried less as a baby, according to family legend repeated so often it became a kind of scripture in our house. She smiled more readily at relatives, charmed teachers effortlessly, never once, as far as I could tell, made anyone's life more complicated than it needed to be. I was, by comparison, the difficult one, though nothing about my childhood self would have struck an outside observer as particularly difficult. I asked too many questions. I noticed too much. I remember, even at 7 or 8, watching my mother's face soften in a specific, involuntary way whenever Renee walked into a room, a softening I never once saw directed at me, an understanding, long before I could have explained it, that something about the two of us landed differently in her chest. The birthday started disappearing gradually, so gradually that no single year ever felt like proof of anything. The year I turned 8, my party was postponed a week because Renee had a regional gymnastics competition that weekend. And by the time the following weekend arrived, my mother decided a party felt unnecessary so long after the actual date. So we simply had cake with dinner instead, a small, quiet substitution. I accepted the way children accept most things adults decide for them, without questioning whether it was fair. The year I turned 12, my birthday fell during Renee's dance recital season, and my mother spent the entire week before it consumed by costume fittings and rehearsal schedules, so exhausted by the time my actual birthday arrived that she told me, apologetically but firmly, that we'd celebrate properly once recital season calmed down. It never quite did. The year I turned 16, Renee had a sudden bout of strep throat 2 days before my birthday, and my mother spent my actual birthday at urgent care with her instead. coming home late enough that I'd already gone to bed, the cake I'd been promised sitting untouched on the counter until I quietly threw it away myself the next morning before school. None of these, on their own, seemed like anything worth resenting. Illness happens. Competitions get scheduled without regard for anyone's convenience. I built an entire adult life around not resenting any single one of them, because taken individually, they all had reasonable explanations, and I had spent years, both as a daughter and later as a professional, believing that a family pattern only counted as real if you could point to one clear, undeniable moment where it revealed itself completely. There was one more birthday I hadn't let myself think about in years, the year I turned 26, 3 months before my wedding to Mark. My mother had offered, unprompted, to host a small engagement dinner that same week, and I remember feeling almost giddy about it, certain this was finally the year the pattern would break on its own. Since there was no gymnastics meet or dance recital left to compete with, Renee having long since aged out of both. 2 days before the dinner, Renee called our mother in tears over a breakup, and by the following morning, the small engagement dinner had quietly transformed into what my mother called, with real enthusiasm, a girls' night to cheer Renee up, held on my actual birthday, in the same backyard, with the same string lights, while my own celebration got folded, once again, into a footnote mentioned almost as an afterthought near the end of the evening. I told myself, driving home that night with Mark, that it didn't matter, that Renee was going through something real, that weddings gave you plenty of other days to feel celebrated. I believed that story completely for 13 years. It took my own daughter, sitting across a dinner table with a fork in her hand, to finally make me stop believing it. I built my career, ironically enough, around exactly the blind spot I carried in my own life. After finishing my graduate work in marriage and family therapy, I spent the first several years of my practice specializing in adult sibling dynamics, in family systems built around a favored child and an overlooked one, watching client after client walk into my office describing, almost word for word, patterns I would later realize I had spent my entire childhood living inside without once naming them for what they were. I was good at my job. I was good, specifically, at helping other people see the shape of something I had never once turned around to look at directly in my own life. I met Mark when I was 29 at a mutual friend's dinner party and married him 3 years later in a small ceremony my mother helped plan, enthusiastically, genuinely, in a way that, looking back now, I recognize as one of the rare occasions where I got her full, undivided attention, mostly because there was no competing event on Renee's calendar that particular season. Mark was steady, warm, endlessly patient with my long work hours and the emotional weight I sometimes carried home from other people's family disasters. For most of our marriage, I would have called him the one relationship in my life that never once made me feel like an afterthought. Which is why, sitting at my kitchen table on my 39th birthday, staring at a photograph of my husband holding a paper plate of my sister's birthday cake in my mother's backyard, the betrayal that cut deepest wasn't Renee's party or my mother's absence. It was the quiet, specific fact that Mark had been there, smiling, apparently untroubled, on the exact day he knew was mine. I called him instead of texting, my hand steadier than I expected. "Where are you?" I asked, though I already knew. "At your mom's," he said, sounding faintly confused by the question, like the answer should have been obvious. "Renee's birthday thing. I told you I'd be working late, but her party ran long, and your mom asked me to stay and help clean up." "It's my birthday too, Mark," I said. "It has been all day. Did that not occur to anyone tonight?" The silence on the line lasted long enough that I understood, before he even answered, that this wasn't the first time he'd known something about my birthday that he'd chosen not to mention. "Laura," he said finally, his voice careful in a way that told me he was choosing each word deliberately, "your mom mentioned a long time ago, years ago actually, that your birthday was a complicated day for the family, that it was easier not to make a big deal out of it, and I never really asked why. I just trusted her. I didn't realize, until right now, hearing your voice, how bad that sounds saying it out loud. I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over the way I'd turned over client sessions at the end of a long day, looking for the detail that explained everything else. My husband hadn't been having an affair. He hadn't lied to protect himself. He had simply, quietly, been recruited into a family pattern years earlier, told a story vague enough that he never thought to question it, and trusted my mother's version of my own life over the version I could have told him myself, if he had ever once asked. The person who finally forced me to stop explaining away 31 years of birthdays wasn't Mark, and it wasn't some dramatic realization I arrived at alone. It was my 14-year-old daughter Emma, 3 weeks before all of this happened, sitting across from me at dinner while I mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Grandma had asked if I could help set up chairs for Aunt Renee's birthday party next month. Emma set down her fork with a deliberateness that made me look up. "Mom," she said, "do you realize your birthday and Aunt Renee's are basically 8 days apart? And every single year, hers is the one with the actual party, and yours is the one where we just kind of order takeout if we remember at all." I laughed it off at first, the same reflex I'd used my entire life, telling her that wasn't really fair, that families get busy, that Renee's birthday simply happened to fall at a more convenient time of year. Emma looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because it was the exact expression I used with clients who were still in the early, defensive stage of seeing a pattern they weren't ready to name yet. "I've been counting since I was like 10, she said quietly. "I just never said anything, because I figured you already knew and just didn't want to talk about it. But you don't know, do you? You actually don't see it." I didn't sleep well that night, and over the following weeks, the discomfort Emma had planted refused to fully leave me. The way a stray splinter keeps announcing itself at odd moments, even after you've convinced yourself it worked its way out on its own. It surfaced again, unexpectedly, during a session with a client I'd been seeing for several months. A woman named Priya, in her early 30s, who had come to therapy struggling to understand why she felt so hollow every year in the week surrounding her birthday. A feeling she couldn't quite explain since her family had never, on paper, done anything specifically unkind. Listening to Priya describe her own childhood, a younger brother who was easier, calmer, more naturally beloved, a mother who reliably found some urgent reason each year that Priya's birthday needed to shrink to make room for something else, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The particular vertigo of watching your own reflection appear inside someone else's story before you've fully admitted it belongs to you too. I asked Priya gently whether she had ever tried mapping out the actual pattern across the years, side by side, rather than trusting her memory of each individual excuse in isolation. She hadn't. I suggested she try. And driving home that evening, I understood, with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives disguised as professional advice you're technically giving someone else, that I needed to take my own suggestion first. I spent the following weekend doing something I had never once done in 39 years, going through old family photo albums and my mother's endless, meticulously organized text message archive, which she had, ironically, once shown me proudly on her phone, boasting that she never deleted anything. I built a simple timeline on a legal pad. Nothing elaborate, no folders, no professionals, just years down one column and what actually happened on each of our birthdays down the other. The way I might sketch out a client's family history during an early session. The pattern, once I finally let myself look at it directly, instead of explaining away each entry individually, was undeniable. 11 of the past 16 years, my birthday had been postponed, shrunk, or quietly absorbed into some other event, almost always one connected to Renee. Renee's birthday, during that same span, had never once been moved, canceled, or diminished for any reason at all. I sat at my kitchen table with that legal pad in front of me and felt something that wasn't quite anger yet, something closer to grief for a version of myself who had spent 3 decades finding reasonable explanations for the same repeating wound. Renee's 37th birthday party arrived 4 weeks later, the same backyard gathering my mother had been quietly organizing since before my own birthday had even happened, extended into a bigger annual tradition this particular year because Renee had recently gotten engaged, giving my mother an extra excuse to make it larger than usual. I was asked, as I always was, to help with setup, and I agreed, because some old habit in me still hadn't fully caught up with what I now understood clearly enough to write down on a legal pad. I arrived early, helped string the same gold balloons I recognized from the photograph that had ruined my own birthday a month earlier, and said nothing to anyone about the legal pad folded quietly in my bag. I hadn't planned, walking into that backyard, to say anything at all that night. I told myself I was simply there to observe, to finally see the pattern in real time instead of through old photographs, the same professional distance I used with clients who weren't yet ready to hear the whole truth at once. The moment arrived without my choosing it. Midway through the party, as my mother raised her glass for what was already the second toast of the evening in Renee's honor, one of Renee's co-workers, a friendly woman I barely knew, turned to me with a genuinely kind smile and asked, "Wasn't your birthday recently too, Laura? We should toast you as well." The backyard went quiet for exactly the length of time it takes an uncomfortable truth to register in a room that has spent years agreeing not to look at it. My mother's smile flickered. The particular flicker I now recognized instantly, the one that meant she was recalculating how to smooth over something before it became a problem. "Oh, we celebrated Laura's already," she said lightly, reaching for the nearest excuse. "It was quieter this year, that's all." I felt something in me finally settle into place. The same settling I feel in session right before a client says the sentence they've been circling for months. "We didn't celebrate it at all," I said, my voice calmer than I expected, calm enough that several conversations around the yard actually stopped. Nobody called, nobody texted. I found out about tonight's party because I saw a photo of it online, on my own birthday, with my husband standing in the background eating cake. "Laura," my mother started, her voice tightening, "please, not tonight. This is Renee's night." "It's always someone's night," I said. "That's actually the whole problem. I did the math this week, Mom. 11 of the last 16 years, my birthday got smaller, or later, or just disappeared entirely, always because something of Renee's needed the space instead. When I was 8, it was gymnastics. When I was 12, it was dance recitals. When I was 16, you spent my actual birthday at urgent care with her, and I threw away my own cake the next morning because nobody remembered it was still sitting there. I'm not upset about any single one of those years. I'm upset that it's been the same year, over and over, for 3 decades, and I only just let myself see it." Renee, standing near the cake table in a dress clearly bought for this exact evening, looked genuinely startled, her expression shifting through confusion and something that looked, unmistakably, like real discomfort. "I didn't know it was that bad," she said quietly. "I mean, I knew our birthdays were close, but I never thought about it like that." "That's the part that isn't your fault," I told her, and meant it. "You didn't choose which of us got the bigger cake every year. Mom did, and I think, on some level, none of us were ever supposed to add it up out loud." My mother set her wine glass down on the table with a hand that wasn't quite steady, her face doing something I had genuinely never seen it do before, the practiced smoothness finally cracking under the weight of 30 guests watching in silence. "I never meant for it to feel like that," she said, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier lightness. "I didn't do it on purpose, Laura. Things just kept happening to line up that way." 11 years in a row isn't things lining up, I said. "That's a pattern. I help people see patterns like this for a living, Mom, and I still didn't see my own until my 14-year-old daughter pointed it out to me at dinner. I'm not asking you to explain every individual year tonight. I'm asking you to actually sit with the fact that it happened, instead of finding a lighter way to say it didn't. I did not stay for the rest of the party. I did not throw anything, did not raise my voice beyond that steady, level register, did not turn the evening into the kind of scene I had spent my entire life being taught, without anyone ever saying so directly that good daughters simply didn't create. I hugged Renee, genuinely, told her I'd talk to her properly once the dust settled, and left through the same gate I'd carried gold balloons through 3 hours earlier, Mark following me out to the car in silence. The weeks after that party were harder than the party itself, in the particular way that consequences always arrive slower and heavier than the moment that causes them. My mother called 4 times over the following 10 days, each call sliding between wounded confusion and clipped defensiveness, insisting I had embarrassed her in front of Renee's friends, that I could have said something privately instead, that I was choosing, at 39 years old, to blow up a small oversight into something far bigger than it deserved to be. I let most of those calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I recognized, professionally and personally, that I needed distance before I could respond to her without simply falling back into the old rhythm of smoothing things over on her behalf. When I finally did call her back, 10 days later, I told her something I had never once told her in 39 years. Calmly, without raising my voice, the way I might explain a boundary to a client rehearsing one for the first time. "I'm not angry that you love Renee," I told her. "I've made peace with the fact that some part of you always found her easier to love than me. And honestly, Mom, I think you've spent so long not looking at that directly that you might not even fully understand why. What I need now isn't an argument about whether it happened. I need you to actually sit with it. And I need my birthday, starting this year, to exist on its own, not folded into anyone else's, not postponed, not quietly skipped. If that's something you can't do, I understand. But then I need you to understand that I won't keep organizing my whole year around events that only ever remember to include me as an afterthought." She didn't apologize fully in that phone call. It took nearly 2 months, and a conversation Renee initiated on her own, apparently unable to stop thinking about that backyard silence, before my mother finally called me one evening and said, in a voice stripped unusually bare of its usual polish, that she had gone back through old photographs herself after Renee pushed her to, and that she couldn't find a single year where my birthday had been treated the way Renee's had, and that she didn't have a good explanation for it beyond the uncomfortable truth that some children simply absorb more of a parent's ease, and other children absorb the parts left over. "I'm not proud of that," she said. "I don't know how to fix 30 years in one conversation, but I don't want there to be a 31st. Renee and I talked properly for the first time about all of it a week after that phone call, sitting across from each other at a small coffee shop neither of us had any particular history with. Neutral ground, the same way I sometimes suggested to clients meeting a estranged sibling for the first serious conversation in years. She told me she'd spent the 2 months since her birthday party replaying small memories she'd never once questioned growing up. The way she always got the bigger slice of cake without asking for it. The way our mother's praise had always arrived faster and warmer whenever it was aimed at her, and how uncomfortable it felt to realize she had simply accepted all of it as normal instead of ever wondering what it cost the person standing next to her. "I don't want you to feel guilty for something you didn't ask for," I told her, and I meant it. "But I do want you to help me hold Mom accountable if this ever starts sliding back into old habits. Because I don't think either of us can see our own blind spots without the other person pointing them out anymore." She agreed, and to her credit, she has kept that promise more consistently than I expected, texting me every year now, weeks before my birthday, to ask what I actually want to do to celebrate, a small gesture that still occasionally catches me off guard with how much it means. Mark's reckoning took a different shape than my mother's. He didn't need months to see the pattern once I finally laid it out for him. The legal pad spread across our kitchen table one evening while Emma did homework upstairs. He sat with it quietly, asked careful questions, and then did something I hadn't expected, driving out to my mother's house himself, alone, the following weekend, not to confront her, but to ask her directly, without me there to soften it, exactly what she had told him all those years ago, and why he had never once thought to question it. He came home that evening and told me only that he owed me an apology far larger than the one he'd already given, that he had let a version of my history get written by someone else for years without ever asking me directly what was true, and that he intended to make my next birthday impossible to overlook, starting with never again taking his information about my own family from anyone but me. My 40th birthday arrived 7 months later, and Mark planned it entirely himself, a small dinner with close friends, Emma helping him choose the restaurant, a slightly lopsided homemade cake Emma had insisted on baking herself despite disastrous prior attempts in the kitchen, and, arriving separately from any family event of Renee's, a card from my mother, handwritten, longer than any note she'd ever given me, admitting plainly, without excuses folded into the middle of it, that she had spent 30 years making me feel like the quieter half of a comparison I never asked to be part of, and that she was trying, imperfectly, and probably too late for some of what it had cost me, to make sure the next 30 looked different. I don't know if my relationship with my mother will ever feel entirely uncomplicated. Some patterns, once you finally see them clearly enough to name out loud, don't dissolve simply because they've been named. But I know that Emma, sitting across from me at that lopsided birthday cake, watching her father and grandmother both make visible, deliberate effort to get something right that had gone wrong for 3 decades before she was even born, is growing up inside a family finally willing to look directly at its own patterns instead of quietly rearranging the furniture around them. I think about Priya sometimes, my client whose hollow, unexplainable birthday sadness first cracked open my own blind spot months before I ever built that legal pad timeline. She did the same exercise I suggested, mapped her own family's pattern across the years, and confronted her mother not long after I confronted mine, in a conversation that went, by her own account, considerably worse than my backyard moment had. I sat with her through the aftermath, the way I imagine, if I'm honest, some quieter version of myself has always wished someone had once sat with me. We help people see the shapes of their own lives for a living, I told her, near the end of one of our sessions. It doesn't mean we're always the first ones to see the shape of our own. Sometimes it takes someone much younger than us, sitting across a dinner table, asking one plain, uncomfortable question we've spent 30 years too practiced at deflecting to actually hear. Priya nodded slowly at that, turning her coffee cup in small circles, the way she often did when something was settling into place. I think I always assumed therapists had already solved their own version of this, she said. It's strange, but it actually makes me trust the process more. Knowing you hadn't, I told her the truth. The same truth I try now to remember every year around the second week of September, when the calendar quietly starts making room for 2 birthdays, 8 days apart instead of 1. Solving it was never really the goal. Seeing it clearly, finally, after 30 years of looking everywhere, except directly at it, turned out to be enough to change everything that came after. She laughed at that, the first real laugh I'd heard from her in months, and told me she was glad, at least, that neither of us was seeing it alone anymore. My birthday this year falls on its own now, fully undisturbed. A date that finally belongs entirely to me instead of arriving every year as the smaller half of someone else's celebration. I spent 39 years believing that noticing my own absence from my family's calendar would be an act of selfishness, something a good daughter simply didn't do out loud. I understand now that noticing it wasn't selfish at all. It was, quite simply, the first honest thing I had ever let myself see about my own life, and once I finally saw it clearly, I discovered I was allowed to ask for something different, out loud, in my own voice, without waiting for anyone else's permission to matter on the one day of the year that was always supposed to be mine.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.